Hello, everyone, and greetings from Chicago. My name is Michael Colma, and I'm the head of Programs and Communications at International House. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program, U.S. China Relations, Where Do We Go From Here? Today's program is one of many held annually by International House as part of our Global Voices lecture series. For over 90 years, International House has been promoting cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among students and scholars from around the world. That mission is made manifest through programs like today's, and that mission guides the work of the 15 other international houses around the world as well. If you're new to iHouse, we hope that you'll join us for future programs. To learn more about us and upcoming programs, please visit ihouse.uchicago.edu and follow us on social media. A few thank yous before we dive into the content of our conversation. Thank you to University Communications here at the university, without whom this program would not be taking place. Thank you to our partner, One Shared World, a nonprofit founded in the depths of the pandemic, dedicated to making change around the world through a shared belief in our collective interdependence. Thanks as well to the iHouse team who helped put this together, and of course to our speakers, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Two housekeeping notes before we get started. The first 50 minutes of the program will feature a conversation with the speakers on the topic at hand. That will be followed by Q&A from the audience. Please feel free throughout the program to drop questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom. And now to our speakers. Professor Zhiluo He is the Fuji Bank and Heller Professor of Finance and Juke Faculty Fellow at Chicago Booth, and is the director of the Becker-Friedman Institute for Economics in China at the University of Chicago, and the faculty co-director of the Fama Miller Center at Chicago Booth. Professor He is a financial economist whose expertise covers financial markets, financial institutions, and macroeconomics broadly. He's also conducting academic research on Chinese financial markets and writing academic articles on new progress in the area of cryptocurrency and blockchains. He's been an associate editor for the Review of Financial Studies and the Journal of Finance, and is serving as the executive editor for the Review of Asset Pricing Studies. Next, Professor Changtai Xie is the Phyllis and Irwin Winkle-Reed Distinguished Service Professor of Economics and PCL faculty scholar at Chicago Booth. At Booth, he conducts research on growth and development. Professor Xie has been a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Banks of San Francisco, New York, and Minneapolis, as well as the World Bank's Development Economics Group and the Economic Planning Agency in Japan. He's a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research, a senior fellow at the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis of Development, and a member of the steering group of the International Growth Center in London. Finally, Professor Kenneth Pomerantz is a university professor of history and in the college at the University of Chicago. His work focuses mostly on China, though he's also very interested in comparative and world history. Most of his research is in social, economic, and environmental history, though he's also worked on state formation, imperialism, religion, gender, and other topics. His current projects include a history of Chinese political economy from the 17th century to the present, and a book called Why is China So Big?, which tries to explain from various perspectives how and why contemporary China's huge landmass and population have wound up forming a single political unit. Thank you all for joining us today, professors. Now let us dive into the topic at hand, and let me briefly set the stage for our conversation. I'm sure we can all agree that the state of the U.S. China relationship is far from ideal. There are disagreements on trade, governing philosophies, international rules of the game, relations with Russia, and so much more, all in the midst of great power competition. And yet over the last few months, the U.S. government has sent the U.S. Secretaries of State, Commerce, and Treasury to meet with their counterparts in China. What's been accomplished by those meetings? What hasn't? What's next? What's the background and context for various points of contention? And how can these great powers get along well enough to help address the planet's greatest existential challenges? So let me start with a big picture question, asking each of you to weigh in for a couple of minutes. Given your expertise and research interests, each of you comes at the U.S.-China relationship from a somewhat different perspective. Using your particular lens, what do you think is the current state of U.S.-China relations? Professor Ha, do you want to jump in first?
Thanks a lot, Michael, for having me here, and together with Changtai and Ken on this. I'm happy to open up with it seems to be not good. Everybody understood it. There was, I would like to mention one thing, which is, Changtai knows that at some point that we thought that maybe the biggest issue is that they don't talk to each other anymore, or refuse to talk to each other anymore. And at some point, we were actually convinced that maybe they don't have any channel to talk to each other. Okay, right? This is something that in the past, always that that whether it's publicly disclosed, they talk to each other, or secretly talk to each other. And for a while that we thought that maybe after COVID, it just that, and also the fact that Donald Trump got it on, and then all the older friends get sidelined, so that Beijing probably don't feel like comfortable to really get into the candidate a conversation with the side. I don't know if Changtai agree with me. I feel we were wrong that in the sense that you look at it, whatever happened in the past half year. While I was a summer in China, Janet Yellen made a visit, and I knew that she talked to many of the people that I thought she should talk to. A very high level and a very knowledgeable economics and finance people. So I feel like that part of the conversation already started. I wouldn't say that they really get anything going, to be honest. So that's basically that my impression is that it seems like both sides that would have the good intention to initiate the talking, and that's a good start. But the recent war issue, all these things just seems like a push to another direction. So basically, I will stop here.
Thanks, Zhiguo. Ken, do you want to jump in here?
Okay, yeah, and I think actually the point that Zhiguo made is a very important one, right? I mean, at the moment, I think it's not likely that relations are going to get much better anytime soon, but we have to at least arrest the downward spiral. And for that, people have to talk. And I think he's right that in that context, the Janet Yellen visit, the other diplomatic contacts are a good sign. On the other hand, one of the alarming signs is that there still doesn't seem to be much in the way of military-to-military contacts. And that's actually pretty scary, right? Because if it is genuinely true that the militaries are not talking to each other, and of course, maybe they are, and we don't know, but if it's genuinely true, that means that one hot-headed lieutenant on either side in the South China Sea can cause a really major international incident. I mean, that's exactly why normally you do talk to the other side, even when relations are hostile. And it doesn't appear that the militaries are talking, and that's scary. Perversely, it may be a good thing in this context that Li Shangfu seems to have disappeared, the Chinese Minister of Defense, because he was under individual sanctions from the United States for his role in a technology deal with Russia a number of years ago. And that just makes it that much harder to talk. So if he's actually replaced, that probably makes it a little easier to move forward on that side. But I would say that's one of the most worrying things right now, that as far as we know, the militaries aren't talking. Good news is that in other places, people are talking, and that at least holds out the promise of stabilizing things, if not improving them. The other thing I'd just say before handing things over to Professor Xie is that it's not just that both sides look at each other with hostility. It's that both sides at the moment have really serious internal problems that make it hard for people to make significant moves. On China's side, a lot of that is the current state of their economy. On the United States side, it's mostly the state of our politics. But that is a problem. And of course, the international situation more generally makes it very difficult.
Right. Thank you very much, Ken. Professor Shea?
So let me use that. I think the issue is deeper than the absence of communication. I think of the issue is really twofold. One, it's that if I think about what's happened, so first let me talk about the U.S. The way that, or the consensus view in the U.S., I think has shifted by quite a bit in the last 5, 6, 7, or 8 years. I think that if I would summarize, it used to be the consensus that the economic rise of China was good for China, good for the US, and good for the world. Now I think there is that I think that I would say the consensus in the US now is that we are not so sure. We are not so sure, and I think sort of the messages and the things that we've been seeing coming out of the U.S. I think reflects that. I hesitate to call it confusion. It's not so much confusion, but it's just this uncertainty over this fundamental question of whether the economic rise of China is good for the U.S. or it is something that is bad for the U.S. And sort of what's going on in the U.S. is just it's this lack of clarity, and I think it's because people just don't know, right? They just don't know, and I think about these visits as being a way of, let me just put it in an uncharitable way. It's about, people talk about, it's about trying to arrest the downfall in the relationship. But it's also, I think, just not having to make a decision, not having to make a decision about what really is in the best interest of in the U.S. And now switching to the Chinese side, I think there's also this lack of clarity about what is it ultimately that the Chinese want, right? What is it? So there's no question about what they want is economic prosperity. I mean, every country in the world wants that. The question is, what are they going to do at the end of the day once they accomplish that goal, right? Is what they want primarily, I'm going to say, internal, domestic, or do the Chinese also have plans for on their vision on what the world is going to look like? And I think there's also this lack of clarity because sometimes if you listen to the language, it does sound like it's not that they have plans for the world, that there's a vision of the world that they have in mind, and partly that is what is feeding back to the U.S. response to the U.S. response, or is it really that really most of what they care about is about internal domestic political control? And if it was that, I think it might be possible to build sort of, I'm going to say, a consensus about the way forward, about the way. But I think I think that is really the fundamental tension that is that is at the heart of it. And I just think it's not going to be solved through you know annual visits by President Xi to the U.S. or by President Biden to China. And it's really this, I think, is really at the core.
Thank you for that. Well, and that's a good jumping off point. I think I want to dive a little bit deeper into some of these issue areas that you've all brought up. And I'll start with where you've just ended there, because I think for much of the last 40 plus years, China's focus has really been on internal growth. Your point, exactly your point. It's about how do we, raise the standard of living of our people. But in recent years, I think one could make the case that under the leadership of President Xi, we've witnessed a marked shift in this stance, right? Gone is the kind of practice of letting others lead while China grew its economy. It strikes me that Xi Jinping has really begun to articulate an alternative to the Western system of multilateral institutions and a rejection of what he sees as a unipolar power structure with the U.S. in the lead, right? And we have I think a very recent manifestation of that policy just last week, right? So China held a meeting of over 150 leaders from around the world to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, in which China has invested over $1 trillion in countries around the world. And so I kind of have this may be a little bit unfair, but feel free to take a crack at any of these questions or all of the questions I'm about to ask, but I have 3 questions related to that thinking. First, can you talk a little bit about the outcomes from those meetings and the potential impact on the U.S.-China relationship? Second, what are the implications of this much more, it's seemingly external-facing policy for the relationship? And last is our countries listening to China? Are they lining up and getting behind this idea that China is talking about of trying to push for a more multipolar world, and with what ramifications, again, I guess, for the U.S.-China relationship? Anybody want to jump in?
Jump in there. So my question is, I don't know to what extent these initiatives really are serious or they really are not. They really are. And here I'll make 2 points. So first about the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road was launched officially, I think it was in 2015 or something like that, right? It was launched officially. What I was seeing on the ground was that the Belt and what people call the Belt and Road, which were these projects, right? The project was already taking place starting in 2011 or 2012. So first, I sort of have this theory that the Belt and Road initially, it really was not started as a program by the central government. That I suspect that it initially was just the outgrowth of the 2008 fiscal stimulus program. That after the fiscal stimulus program was over, there was all this excess capacity left over. So one of the natural things for all these companies to do was to go overseas, and then maybe this is I think my guess of what it was that starting in 2014 or 2015, the Xi administration decided to take credit for all these things that were already taken place and put a blue ribbon around it and called it the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't mean to suggest that there weren't any substantive changes, because I think the most substantive change was that after the program became something official, it started to become these projects. They started to become eligible for official sources of finance, whereas before they weren't. But here's question number one: to what extent are these programs really something? I'm going to say part of an explicit strategy for China to present its vision vis-a-vis the world, or whether it is responding to some other internal domestic political force that has nothing to do with the way that we are with the way that we are in that with the way that we are interpreting it. And I'll just say that whenever I see like I'll give you just what we've been seeing the last 3 weeks in the conflict between Israel and into Israel and Hamas, that I don't see the Chinese foreign policy apparatus like having a whole lot of depth. So they will make statements like it's good to have world peace, the two parties, but in terms of really putting in the effort, putting in the resources to actually be a global player, a real global player that's going to influence the global debate. I don't see that. I mean, I don't see that yet. I don't see that really happening. I don't see that really happening. So I guess if you'd ask me, I would say that I suspect, and I would just say that it's just a suspicion that really at the end of the day, it's all about internal domestic political considerations, and all these external pieces are things that arise endogenously from that. Now, now maybe the next question that we can ask is, why might this, this be something that arise out of domestic political consideration? And I'll just say maybe it's a way to try to project domestic strength domestically, given that so my sense is that the current regime, President Xi, does not come out of the I would just call it the traditional factional structure of the Chinese of the Chinese so sort of that traditional source of political strength, internal political strength is not there, so that something else has to substitute for that. But then it's leading to all these external repercussions, but maybe it's not all intentional. So I'll just throw that out there.
Let me try and get Ken and Jirgo in here. Ken, it looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that actually Belt and Road starts mostly not from Beijing, right? It starts from lots of people who have surplus steel and concrete to sell, and they're looking for a place to sell it. And part of what happens in an authoritarian system is that if the head guy says that he has this vision called Belt and Road, then you take the thing you were already doing and say, hey, this is part of Belt and Road, right? And I think there was an awful lot of that a lot of projects that began for much more pedestrian reasons suddenly came under this umbrella. I would firmly agree with that. At the same time, though, I think, once these things get started, to some extent, they have a momentum of their own. And B, even to the extent that the sources are domestic, the domestic push is not going away. I mean, again, if you think of somebody who's got steel and concrete to sell, well, the domestic market for steel and concrete is not looking that good with the housing sector in meltdown. And I think everybody agrees that domestic construction has to shrink over the next, we don't know how long, but that there's there's the potential for a very painful shakeout. And that means that the people who produce inputs for that stuff, they don't necessarily want to fold their tents if there's another thing they can do. And that thing may well be selling the stuff overseas with government finance, right? Now that they have decided that what they're doing is part of Belt and Road, they may as well keep it going. I also think that there's a distinction between Belt and, we shouldn't treat all Chinese assertions of, vigor beyond their borders as the same thing, right? There's nothing intrinsically wrong with wanting to build railways.
Right.
They're sending a lot of capital to places that in many cases desperately need the capital. That's very different from things like trying to enforce the 9-dash line and ramming Philippine ships. That's to me much more worrisome. And again, I don't have any sense of what level that's being approved. Again, is that some hot-headed local, or is that being signed off on either before the fact or after the fact at a much higher level? I certainly don't know. Maybe there are people in Washington listening to intelligence sources who do know, but I'm not one of them. So I think it's complicated, and I agree that there's not a master plan, capital M, capital P. But there's also, I think, not much reason to think that there will be an easing off of Chinese assertiveness. And that has some forms that the United States should be perfectly willing to live with, and others that are much more worrisome.
I would like to even make more bolder. Where they're coming from, I don't think it really matters. In China, it's just always like that. We need a slogan. So slogan is a very, very important part of do stuff, so that everybody gets a excuse to interpret whatever they wanted away. I have a bunch of friends actually were involved in this. This happened like several days ago, right? This is just 10-year anniversary, and I saw a lot of faces I never thought they should show up. For instance, the finance guys. I know some people in Hong Kong that somehow gets involved in this One Belt One Road thing, and I'm very proud to sign some deals with some other countries. And I was just checking the news, just prepare for this talk. There's a total number of business deals, totaling $64 billion signed in this meeting. Now they must bunch all the things, just everything, just put it in here, and they with this event, then they signed this, then it just boosted the kind of like their all these atmosphere. But I do think that this the Belt One Road, One Belt Road initiative kind of lasting long. I do not see anything bad, except that there's a lot of people worry about the bad debt in these countries. So COVID doesn't help. But other than that, I talked to some friends in Russia. A lot of good. Russia, think about it, is basically there's a lot of things that are being supported from China, and they signed a bunch of deals. Putin showed up. These are the new exports. Seems to be that Beijing is aiming on, and that's again the same umbrella, because that's part of the Belt Road. It's just the same thing. So all these things are just, I feel like this will be lasting long. I don't think the U.S. and the Western, like traditional Western countries, obviously, is standing against it, it seems. And China is trying to manage it in a way that view that as a business operation. And I don't feel too much that this is right or wrong. I feel it's a little bit on the positive side, actually.
Okay, so I want to pick up, you said two things in there, Jagua, that lead to me a couple of other questions. I'm not sure where to start, but I think I'll start with the Russia side. Since it seems like to have a conversation like that, we do need to kind of bring in the Russia equation. And since it seems to be very front and center, I think it's quite obvious, of course, the U.S. stance on what's going on in the Ukraine and the billions of dollars that we're, spending in military aid that we're providing. On the flip side of that, right, and I think we all know, at least kind of the public story about, just prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Xi and Putin met, talked about, building a relationship without boundaries. President Putin, of course, was at this Belt and Road Initiative and celebrations last year, so that China has a different kind of relationship, of course, at the very least, and they talked about further deepening their friendship last week. So that leads me to at least a couple of different questions. One, of course, kind of bigger picture. How does the either side of this relationship, either the China-Russia relationship or the U.S.-Russia relationship, impact the U.S.-China relationship? And then Ken, I guess, in thinking kind of historically about things, and perhaps this is the wrong way to think about that, I'm wondering if you can provide a bit of context, kind of a historical context, given the nature of the relationship between China and the then Soviet Union in the 20th century. Are they in it for the long haul, these two countries? Should we expect something similar to happen down the road? Can you look into your crystal ball and see anything there?
Thanks, Don.
I guess I should start by saying that my crystal ball is off being repaired, because it has a mediocre track record. But, I guess, I don't think the Soviet-Chinese relationship of the 50s is all that relevant, except maybe that it provides some people with a kind of nostalgic haze that they can wrap around certain things. But, if people who even remember that well enough to be nostalgic about it are getting pretty long in the tooth now. So I don't think that specific part of the historical background is all that important. But there are certain enduring reasons for Russia and China to want a reasonably cooperative relationship, right? I mean, most obviously, they have a very long border, right? And it's not in either one of their interests for that border to be hostile. They also have a lot of natural complementarities in trade, right? Russia is a natural resource rich, sparsely populated country. China is the opposite. There are lots of complementarities there. And if you want to bring in the US relationship, for China, I think one real goal that it's understandable that they are pursuing, but that does make the United States nervous, is they want to have supply lines for a lot of essential resources that the United States Navy can't get in the way of. And things like natural gas from Russia fit that vision, right? It makes both economic and geopolitical sense for them. So, there are reasons that are just, rooted almost literally in the landscape for Russia and China to have some kind of a positive relationship. That doesn't give you a friendship without limits. But let's also be real. They don't have a friendship without limits. China is providing Russia with various goods that the US wishes they wouldn't. Those include some goods that have some dual use technologies, so civilian goods that also have military applications. But they're not actually, for instance, really selling arms to them, as far as we know. And that's a big deal, right? That's a huge deal, and we shouldn't minimize that. You know, the United States does not like the stance China is taking. For that matter, we don't like the stance that India is taking, but we don't get quite as agitated in public about it for various reasons. But, India is a huge customer for Russian gas. It's something the U.S. doesn't like, but the U.S. has to live with. And I think, yes, China and Russia had talked about how they share a sense that they want a world in which the United States can't push other people around. But that's not actually a very powerful positive vision. And I don't think it's a vision that's driving all that much. I think sort of mundane but significant things like population to resource ratios at the presence of a very long border are actually much more important, and they portend continued cooperation between Russia and China, which will annoy the United States significantly. But I don't really think there's any friendship without limits. Whether you think that would be good or bad, I don't think it's happening.
Yeah, but there's no friendship without limits. It's just the talking. I at some point I was surprised that Putin visited the North Korean, right? And then we putting on the square over everything, you realize this is about the weapon, but China just wanted to do business with Russia. And in the same time, obviously, China would like to have a very good relationship with the U.S. And this is exactly Michael was on this question on that. I'm not a international relationship guy. Just all these things, it's all lip service to me. And what nothing either side could do. And the same thing like India. India seems like doing extremely well this time, like get everybody's trust. I don't know how they did it. And then yesterday, actually, last week, there's like Caixin is the news, like a very, very like a really the greatest, most informative magazine in China on that. The weekly Caixin is on Modi, and analyzing how did they like managing the relationship and make everybody happy. All these things is just I feel this is something that are on the plate, and then and also that to be honest, that from the China perspective, it's not morally wrong at all to support the Russia. And you might feel like, there's a start a war, all these things. But that's not the Chinese people were the way they were thinking. There's a strong supporters on the Russia side to just have started with this conflict with the Ukraine. Let me stop here.
Sung Tai, anything to add to that?
Sung Tai, you're muted.
Let me just say that I agree with the Ziguo that it's a lot of it is lip service, and I'll just say that I'm going to believe the official announcements when I see a child of a party elite choose to go to Moscow State instead of going to Stanford. So when I see that for the very first time, I will believe it. I've yet to see them, but. So that's all I'll say.
Can I just nudge you each, or whoever wants to jump in here, just slightly further on that? So, and I completely appreciate and understand what you've all just said. That said, I still find myself wondering that it's certainly whether or not it is a relationship without borders, or like this great relationship between the leaders happening. It certainly does complicate I think, the U.S. China relationship. Certainly from the U.S. perspective, whether or not it's, looking at domestic politics, and it was brought up earlier, kind of the complexities of that. And I think, Chung Tai, you had mentioned how that viewpoint has changed over the course of time in the United States, that it was good for China to be growing because it was good for the United States to be growing. It strikes me that it still complicates the relationship in some ways. Thoughts on that?
Yes, I think on the margin it does, but I forgot who was it that said it. I think about China's position relative to Russia, it's really not that different from India's position relative to to Russia. There's not a whole lot of difference. But so I don't like it. So if I don't know, so what would be what the U.S. would like to do? So say that the Chinese were to adopt the Japanese position relative to Russia. Is that going to help in the margin? Probably yes. Is that really going to change the view in Washington towards China? Probably not, right? Because I think that the issues are deeper. So I don't really, yeah. I mean that's my sense.
Teddy,
Yeah, I would have to agree there. I mean, and I think one indication of that is that, the extent of consensus, at least among elected officials in the United States. I mean, I think there are some different things going on in the bureaucracy, but among elected officials on a tough attitude towards China is just remarkable, right? And it's actually, there's more consensus on that actually than there is on opposition to Putin's invasion of Ukraine itself, right? I mean, there's a non-trivial faction within the Republican Party that doesn't really seem to have a problem with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which suggests that, again, if China were to switch its position on this one issue, the gains for them in their relationship with the United States might not be all that big. And given that, why should they do it? I mean, I'm sad to have to say that, but I think it's true.
Don't forget that there's a huge amount of economic benefits. The RMB internationalization helped recently pick up quite a bit on that region.
Yeah. And actually, if I could just loop back from this to something that Professor Xie said very early, which I thought was quite a good point, that once upon a time, there was a, maybe not a consensus, but a broadly held belief in the United States that China's growth was a good thing. And now there's a lot more ambivalence about that. Mm-hmm. But I think, if you flip that around and ask yourself, well, would a serious economic crisis in China be a good thing? I think you'd have to be a pretty hardcore China hawk to entertain that view, right? I think, almost any scenario you can play out from that is a bad one, right? It's not going to make China easier to deal with if its economic woes worsen significantly. And in that context, I think the trade with Russia, again, it annoys a lot of Americans. On some kind of personal moral level, it annoys me too. But practically speaking, it's not going to stop. And we shouldn't want the economic confrontation to get more stark.
So let's jump then, because people have brought up the economy a couple of different times in here. And before I ask the next question, just want to remind people who are listening, please we're going to open up the floor to questions from the audience in a few minutes. So feel free to start using the Q&A function in Zoom to toss your questions in there, and we'll dig those out as we get to that portion of the program. So let's talk about the economy, or how the economic relationship plays into the broader relationship, right? Of course, the Biden administration hasn't overturned tariffs that were implemented during the Trump administration. They've implemented export controls on the sale of advanced tech to China. At the same time, although other countries might be happy with the kind of growth that's going on in China, just over the course of the last month, private sector investment has fallen, property investment has slid as well. Just yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, Chinese shares fell to the lowest level since before the COVID pandemic. So there's questions around the financial markets and the state of financial markets, I think, in China. I don't know, Zhiguo, maybe you want to get us started since you're the financial market analyst. Just talking a little bit more then about kind of the economic relationship and where we are with that in the relationship.
Oh, well, I mean, it seems there are two questions. One is the current status, right? Where we are now for China, and then what's the relationship on many other parts. The economic growth wise, the most recent number is 5.2. That's a quarterly number, and at least the goal, of the overall year is above 5. So that's like among the community that I know, that they feel like it's there should be no problem to reach that goal, and that seems to be on the okay trajectory. Having said that, everybody understands that this is a very difficult transition period, and a lot of people would love to get another round of a big stimulus from Beijing. Beijing decided not to so far, and I hope they still hang on not to. On that part, many of my friends may disagree. I don't know Changtai's view, but I hope they don't do that. And again, it's just a situation that China has to deal with for a long while. Maybe they picked the wrong timing, but I don't feel like whether there are better timing to do that as well. And the biggest transition, obviously, is this real estate led growth. We're gonna already end. If you travel to China, you know that the infrastructure already pretty good. There are other parts you can do small fixes, but mostly it's already done. With that, what do? You need to develop other parts of the growth, and it's unclear that which part will pop out first. The electricity car, all these things are fast growing, and I want to mention that my friends at Russia that was telling me that recently, like all the cars on the road are being replaced by BYD. BYD is a good, very, very frontier car manufacturer, EV electric car manufacturer in Shenzhen. They're exporting all these cars there. So all these things, it seems like there's a one direction plus a chip, but otherwise, like I feel it is a situation where the government knows this is a problem. There's a lot of bombing parts that they need to take off, but seems that they would like the economy to grow its own, and hopefully it's at stabilize, and then hopefully it can find somewhere to go. That's just as my view over reporting the current status, and I will let the Changtai and Ken to jump in on implications.
Thanks, Zhiguo. Ken or Changtai?
I could say something that I think about China as having two big problems right now, which is one is what Zhiguo mentioned, which is transitioning from an economy where lots of resources have been allocated to real estate to an economy where I think it's clear that there needs to be less resources allocated to real estate. The other thing is, the other issue or crisis, or is really the crisis of the private sector. And so it's really these two things. It's really these two things at the same time. And to follow up on one of the things that Sugo mentioned, if you believe that these are the two crises that China has, the fiscal stimulus is neither here nor there. I mean, it's about the stupidest policy action that one can take, if you believe that these are the two issues that China faces now. On the other hand, I would say that there still are enough real pockets of strength in the Chinese economy, in terms of its expertise and its dominance, and it's sort of just this very wide experience in, I'm just going to call it manufacturing, learning by doing, that very few countries in the world have. Like in terms of sort of the underlying capabilities of actually making stuff at scale, Tsugo mentioned the strength in the strength of China in the EV supply chain. So I would say, if I think about my best guess for what China is what's going to happen going forward, you have these two forces that are working in opposite direction. That you really do have real pockets of strength, but you have these two things that are really dragging the Chinese economy down. So as a consequence, my best guess is that I'm just going to split the difference. That I don't see a scenario for an economic crisis. I don't see a scenario in which it's going to go back to the days of the growth that it had in the 1990s and 2000. I think it's just going to be what we're seeing, which is 3-4% growth for the foreseeable future. So, sometimes the way I say is that, what do I think is going to be the future of China in the next 2 decades? It's going to be Mexico. It's going to be Mexico, which is neither a crisis. It's just doing fine, right? It's just doing it's not imploding. It's not growing like a superstar. It is just doing just fine, right? It's doing just, so it's just going to be a normal country in terms of its economy. That's my best guess.
Okay. Ken?
Yeah, I mean, I think normal is probably the best guess. But I do think two things to add. I mean, one is, for people in our audience who don't obsessively follow these things, it's probably worth just giving a sense of just how big this real estate mess is. By some accounts, property development, together with its upstream and downstream components, right, things like steel and lumber for construction, is close to a quarter of the Chinese economy. In the United States, it's something like 8%, right? So you're talking about the need for a pretty dramatic downsizing, right? Because population growth is no longer going to power real estate demand. There's still some urbanization left to go, still some people who will leave the countryside, but the pace of that is nothing like what it once was. So, that's just a huge engine of growth that isn't going to be much of an engine of growth. And those resources have to go somewhere. They have to find something better to do with them. The second thing that I think is worth talking about is the fiscal side of this. Because of the peculiarities of the Chinese fiscal system, local governments live and die on fees from property developers. And they live and die on being able to borrow against the presumed appreciation of property. That's not happening now. There are lots and lots of local governments in China that are in a tremendous mess. Beijing has the capacity to bail them out and presumably will, right? It's not a federal system, so it's not like they really have a choice. Nor is the amount of debt really terrifying given the size of the Chinese economy. They can do this. But presumably when they do it, they will ask those localities to pay a price. There will be some kind of greater centralization that will come out of this. And given that some of China's other problems seem to be precisely the result of too much centralization, that's probably not a good thing.
Oh, Michael.
Go ahead.
I was just trying to say that the so-called dissolving the debt was the constantly coming back topic in the past week, past month, and there's a series of new policy coming out. Basically, Beijing, the central, will come up with a plan to basically swap out the debt again. So that's just exactly a replication what happened 15 years ago. The difference this time is that it's just a kind of like a slowly doing it and not like a big one package. The second thing is also that I was wondering that what kind of you said about the centralization is going on. So far, no yet. so just so far, no yet. So far, basically just swapping. Now, it's not a good thing either, because then if you're just swapping, then you just have all the like buried new seed of the next time, right? But it will be very worthwhile to watch out. So whenever people say, we have a big mess of debt, that all these things, there's a very easy, simple way, and I think this is the right way, that Beijing is the one to pay it, because this is exactly Beijing need to pay.
So I want to get to audience questions. Thank you very much, Jigwell. I want to get to a few audience questions. We only have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to just take a couple of the questions and throw them out to you to try and respond to it. And we'll try and, keep our answers, tight, just because we're limited on time and we want to get to these questions. So one listener writes in, the U.S. has recently started, this is kind of along the lines of some of the stuff we've been talking about. The U.S. has recently started imposing restrictions on China's ability to access cutting-edge computational hardware. Keeping in mind that China has been working on their internal computer chips for a while now, how does this benefit either country? Because China's internal chip technologies are closing the gap at a rapid pace. Do you think this and other recent developments signal another Cold War, with the U.S. on one side and China, Russia, and other nations on another side? Anyone care to take that?
I would say this sounds like a Cold War. At least my friends in Beijing is thinking this chip war, right? Chip war is like Cold War to me. So I will stop here.
I would say that, let me just say that first. I mean, the real genius of the export controls is that it doesn't really have that much of an effect on the U.S. because the U.S. doesn't make chips. It has a very big effect on Taiwan, who are the main. So it has a very big negative effect on semiconductor chips from Taiwan, which is and it's and then it has a negative effect in China in terms of, but I think also it has a very big effect in terms of the narrative in China, on sort of how people think that this is obviously evidence that you want to kill us. And I think it also makes all these visits, since Michael, you started with asking about the visits. I think that it also makes all these visits seem just insincere, right? Insincere. That is, you visit, and then the day later or whatever soon afterwards, you announce this chip. So wait, all this thing that you were saying during your visit, your visit, you could not have been telling the truth. There's no way that you could have been telling the truth, and then at the same time you were planning this. You were planning this. So I think that um, um, now the argument by the U.S. is that it does this for national security reasons, and then once it says that, it's really hard to prove or disprove that. They could be right, they could be wrong, and then it sort of doesn't allow us with our usual standards of scholars in terms of finding. So they make a statement that is just not provable or disprovable. So there's not a whole lot that we can say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Zhang Dai is right that the big effect here is on the narrative, right? That whatever effect the chip restrictions actually have on China, it's hard to know, but it's probably not dramatic. What it does do is reinforce this sense that, oh, you are out to get us. And of course, what it does do domestically in the United States is it gives the Biden administration a certain amount of political cover, right? Because right now, they need to be seen as being tough on China. But, narratives aside, the reality is this is not the Cold War, right? During most of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union had almost no common interest besides avoiding blowing each other up, right? There was very little trade. There was very little cultural exchange. There was nothing like an awareness of global problems that had to be managed with both superpowers' participation, like climate change. The degree of confrontation without cross-cutting ties that existed for much of the Cold War just isn't going to happen, right? I mean, trade is still very big. There are still a lot of Chinese students coming to the United States and some Americans going to China. It's not the Cold War. And thank God, because given the existence of problems that do need to be jointly managed, the environment being the most obvious one, a return to a real Cold War would be catastrophic.
Okay, so let me get to another question. Thank you all very much. While one listener writes in, while debates continue about the existence, again, back to kind of this great power competition between the US and China, they're assuming that a competition does exist, and they're wondering, what is the implication for the Middle East?
I'll give a quick answer. I don't think there are any. I don't think there are any. Like the issues in the Middle East go back to the days of Christ, and the U.S. and China could both disappear from the face of the earth, and the issues in the Middle East are still going to be there. So yeah. It's a quick answer.
No, thank you. Ken, Jergo, anything to add to that?
I mean, I wouldn't maybe be quite so dismissive of the impact, but I agree that it's relatively marginal. There's possibly somewhat more impact we should remember the Middle East is more than the Israel-Palestine problem. And when you talk about things like Iran, then the US-China rivalry begins to have somewhat greater impact. because China is both an outlet for Iranian oil and a potential source of various technologies, et cetera, that the West doesn't want to give to Iran. So there's some impact there, but it's even there, I think it's not a big deal.
So we've only got a few minutes left. Let me pick up on something to give you each a minute or two at most to kind of give almost a closing thought here. I mean, Ken, you kind of brought up a bit of these kind of global existential challenges that we really haven't hit on. So I'm wondering if you could talk either to where are you most hopeful that the two countries can work together to help to address issues such as those enormous existential challenges, or just in general, where are you most optimistic about the potential for the future of the relationship?
I mean, I'm not very optimistic right now, but I guess I would say that in some ways you have to believe that neither the White House nor Zhongnan Hai are crazy. And that means that they both understand that there are limits to how confrontational they can get with each other, because there are still very important shared interests. That doesn't mean that it's easy to get beyond the domestic political pressures and the sort of bruised feelings on both sides, and sometimes real, sometimes fake moral outrage to get to those shared interests. But I think both sides know they're there. Climate is the most obvious one, but there are a whole bunch of other things, and there is still, as I say, right, there's still an awful lot of trade. There's still an awful lot of students and tourists and so on and so forth. There's a fabric of contact that goes way beyond what there was between the US and the Soviet Union, except maybe in the very last few years of the Cold War. So that's, at least there are bases for cooperation, and I suspect a shared understanding that there has to be some cooperation if you can clear away some of this other stuff. Mm-hmm. That's not going to mean that it's easy.
Thanks, Ken. Jergoa?
I was searching my head that what could be could be cooperative. The climate is one, but I just don't feel like it's a very China side trying a lot, but I just do not know whether there's a concrete thing you can work together. There's one part actually. I was chatting with Chong'en. Changtai must know. He's a dean of the Tsinghua School of Economic Management. He was proposing one topic on AI. So around that time where ChatGPT just got up, and that seems like there's a lot of issues that needs to get a coordinated effort in thinking about what we need to have certain rules on that. And this is extremely, you could make it extremely apolitical. You could also make it very political, of course. So maybe that's the one thing that everybody will be seeing the opportunity to really talk to each other.
Changtai?
I think the only thing of substance that I see is going to continue in the future are essentially relationships between people. I mean and I think Ken has pointed out that is, I think, the one positive sign that these relationships are still thick. are so thick. But just anything else, I think, is really just not going to happen. But I think that there's enough has happened over the last 30 or 40 years in terms of the building of personal relationships, and I'm hopeful that those relationships are gonna continue, and they're gonna sustain us over what is likely to be a long winter. Uh, um, but that's really what I see.
Final, I thought that the U Chicago international students there's no big change, right? from China to the to University of Chicago.
Yeah, right. The students are still coming here. The students are still coming here. They're still so I don't. It's that whenever I see the students, I talk to them. Or when I talk with the Chinese colleagues, it's that which gives me hope.
Well, that's a good way, I think, to wrap up the conversation today, and a good way to tie back into my opening comments about what International House has been about for the last 91 years, which is really about bringing international students and scholars together to create those relationships, to create those friendships, to build that cross-cultural understanding, to bring people together, to create that fabric that you've all just talked about. I want to thank all three of you so much for your willingness to take time out of your days to spend with us, to share your thoughts about the relationship and what's going on in China and the United States. I want to thank everybody who's online for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you back again at more iHouse programs in the future, and hoping you all have a great day. Thank you, everybody.